The heavy, wooden door creaked as Emma turned the key. Her mind heavy with thoughts she couldn't quite shake. Her townhouse, dimly lit and eerily silent, had always been a place of solitude, a sanctuary after long, grueling days. Tonight, however, it felt different. She was no longer alone. "Leo," she called out, her voice cutting through the quiet. She set her keys on the counter and glanced around the living room. It was tidy, the way she'd left it that morning, except for a duffel bag by the couch and a pair of sneakers hastily kicked off near the door. "Yeah, I'm here," came a deep voice from the kitchen. It was steadier than she remembered, a far cry from the boyish tone she associated with her younger stepbrother. Moments later, Leo appeared in the doorway, a glass of water in hand. Emma studied him briefly, caught off guard by how much he'd changed. At 19, Leo had grown taller and broader. His once gangly frame now filled out with lean muscle. His dark hair, slightly messy, fell over his forehead in a way that made him look older, more confident. There was an ease to his movements, a casual grace she hadn't noticed before. "Hey," he said with a small smile. "I hope it's okay I helped myself to some water. I wasn't sure when you'd be back." "Of course it's fine," Emma replied, shaking off her surprise. "You're staying here for the weekend after all. Make yourself at home." Leo nodded, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than expected. "Thanks again for letting me crash here. Mom and Dad were pretty last minute about this whole trip, huh?" Emma shrugged, moving to hang her coat on the rack. "That's nothing new. They love springing surprises. But it's not a big deal. It's nice to have company for once." She meant it, though the admission felt strange. Emma had always valued her independence, especially after the messy breakup she was still nursing like a fresh wound. But having Leo around, even temporarily, felt oddly comforting. "So," she said, turning back to him, "what have you been up to? I feel like I haven't seen you in ages." Leo leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed. "Not much really. Colleges. Well, it's college. Classes, assignments, the usual grind. Honestly, it's nice to get away from it all for a few days." Emma nodded, understanding the sentiment. She motioned for him to sit, and they settled in the living room, the small space feeling suddenly cozier with his presence. As they talked, Emma found herself surprised by how easy it was to fall into conversation with him. He wasn't the awkward teenager she remembered. He was funny, thoughtful, and quick-witted. The hours slipped by, their conversation weaving from light-hearted anecdotes to more personal topics. At one point, Leo mentioned his parents' constant hovering, a frustration Emma could easily relate to. "They still treat me like I'm 15, he said, shaking his head. "It's exhausting." Emma laughed softly. "That sounds about right. They mean well, but yeah, they can be a bit much. I guess I just got used to it." Leo tilted his head, his expression curious. "What about you? You've been on your own for a while now, right? How's that been?" Emma hesitated, the question touching a nerve. "It's fine. I like my space. Work keeps me busy, so it's not like I have much time to feel lonely or anything." Leo didn't press, but the way he looked at her made her feel exposed, as if he could see through the carefully constructed facade she'd built around herself. "Well," he said after a moment, "it's nice here. You've made a good home for yourself." The compliment caught her off guard. She smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. As the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift subtly. Emma couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. She found herself noticing things she shouldn't, the way Leo's voice had deepened, the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence. It was unsettling, and yet, she couldn't deny the flicker of warmth that stirred within her. When the clock struck midnight, Emma stood, stretching to shake off the strange thoughts creeping into her mind. "We should probably call it a night," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Long day tomorrow." Leo rose as well, his gaze steady. Yeah, you're probably right. As they prepared to part ways for the night, Emma paused in the doorway of her bedroom, glancing back at him. Good night, Leo. Good night, Emma, he replied, his voice soft but firm. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been, and she couldn't understand why. Emma told herself it was nothing, just the remnants of a long day and a mind prone to overthinking. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something she wasn't sure she wanted to face. In the silence of the night, the weight of their proximity pressed down on her, heavy and unrelenting. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure she wanted to be alone. Emma awoke to the faint sound of clinking dishes, her heart momentarily disoriented by the intrusion of noise in a home she'd grown used to keeping silent. For a second, she thought she'd dreamt the presence of another, but then the events of the previous night returned. Leo was here. She slipped out of bed, pulling on a cardigan as she padded barefoot to the kitchen. There he was, standing at the stove, his back to her, cooking something that filled the air with the rich, warm scent of butter and spices. Morning, she said softly, leaning against the doorway. Leo turned, his smile immediate. Morning. Hope you don't mind. I thought I'd make breakfast. Figured it's the least I could do for crashing here. Emma waved a dismissive hand, though she couldn't help but notice how at ease he seemed in her space. I don't mind. It's nice, actually. He raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in his eyes. You're not much of a morning person, huh? Not without coffee, she admitted with a laugh. Leo poured her a cup and handed it to her, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact was innocent, fleeting, yet it sent a jolt through her, a spark she tried to ignore. She took the cup and focused on the warmth of the ceramic against her palms, willing her thoughts to stay grounded. They sat down to eat, the conversation light and easy at first. But as the minutes passed, the air between them seemed to thicken, the silences stretching longer than they should have. Emma found herself stealing glances at him, noticing the way his jaw tightened when he chewed, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. So, Leo said, breaking the quiet, what's the plan for today? Emma hesitated. She hadn't thought much beyond surviving the weekend. I don't know. I figure we could just hang out, maybe watch a movie or something. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Sounds good to me. The rest of the day passed in a blur of mundane activities. Cleaning, chatting, and eventually settling on the couch to watch a movie. The space between them was comfortable at first, but as the hours wore on, Emma became acutely aware of how close they were. It was during the second movie that it happened. A scene on the screen, a dramatic, emotionally charged confession of love, filled the room with tension. Emma felt it resonate within her, stirring emotions she'd tried to bury. She glanced at Leo, and to her surprise, he was already looking at her. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them in that small, dimly lit room. You okay? Leo asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emma nodded, though her heart was pounding. Just tired, I guess. But Leo didn't look convinced. He leaned slightly closer, his gaze searching hers. You've seemed distracted today. Is something bothering you? Emma opened her mouth to reply but found herself at a loss for words. How could she explain the whirlwind of emotions she'd been battling since he arrived? The guilt, the confusion, the strange, unspoken pull between them. I'm fine, she said finally, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Leo hesitated, then reached out, his hand resting lightly on hers. The touch was gentle, reassuring, but it sent a shockwave through her. Emma, he said quietly, his tone uncharacteristically serious. You can talk to me. You know that, right? Her defenses crumbled under the weight of his sincerity. It's just, things have been hard lately. work, relationships. Everything feels like it's falling apart. Leo's grip on her hand tightened slightly, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. You don't have to go through it alone. I'm here. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Emma's chest ache. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the boy she remembered but a man, someone who cared deeply, perhaps too deeply. Before she could stop herself, she leaned in, closing the distance between them. Their lips met, the kiss tentative at first, as if testing the waters. But it quickly deepened, the pent-up tension between them spilling over like a dam breaking. For a brief, exhilarating moment, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the guilt. Only the warmth of his touch and the way he held her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. But reality crashed down on her like a tidal wave, and she pulled back abruptly, her breathing ragged. Leo, we can't, this is wrong. He looked at her, his expression a mix of longing and regret. Emma. No, she said firmly, though her voice wavered. This can't happen. It's not right. Leo didn't argue, but the pain in his eyes was clear. He nodded slowly, giving her space to retreat. Emma stood, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off the cold. I need some time. Can't. I just need to think. She left the room without another word, the sound of her footsteps fading as she climbed the stairs. Alone in her bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. What had she done? What had she allowed to happen? But even as she wrestled with her guilt, a small, insistent voice in the back of her mind whispered the truth she wasn't ready to face. For the first time in a long while, she hadn't felt alone. Downstairs, Leo sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists as he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. He knew he should feel ashamed, but all he could think about was the way her lips had felt against his, the way she'd fit so perfectly in his arms. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The morning came reluctantly, dragging with it the weight of unspoken words. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, staring out the window at the overcast sky. The events of the previous night clung to her like a shadow, impossible to shake. She heard Leo before she saw him, his footsteps hesitant as he entered the room. When he finally appeared, his usual ease was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that made her chest tighten. "Morning," he said, his voice subdued. Emma forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Morning." An uncomfortable silence settled between them, stretching longer than either would have liked. Leo finally broke it, his tone careful, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing. "About last night." Emma's stomach twisted. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. "Leo, No, let me talk first," he interrupted gently. He sat down across from her, his gaze steady. "I need to say this." She nodded, bracing herself. "I don't regret what happened," he began, his words both surprising and unsettling her. "I can't. But I know it wasn't fair to you. I shouldn't have let it go that far." Emma blinked, caught off guard by his candidness. "Leo, it wasn't just you. I let it happen too." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the way his jaw tightened. "I know, but I can see how much it's tearing you up inside. And that's the last thing I want. I never wanted to hurt you." His sincerity cut through her defenses, leaving her exposed. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever this is between us, it can't happen again. It's not right." Leo nodded, though the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "I understand. But that doesn't make it any easier, does it?" "No," Emma said softly. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken emotions pressing down on them. Emma finally stood, unable to sit still any longer. "I think it's best if you leave today," she said, her voice trembling. "I need some space to figure things out." Leo looked at her, his expression a mix of hurt and acceptance. "If that's what you need, I'll go. But Emma, I don't want this to be goodbye forever." She didn't respond, her heart too heavy with conflicting emotions. By the afternoon, Leo's duffel bag was packed, and the house felt emptier than it had in years. He stood by the door, his hand resting on the handle, as if reluctant to leave. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said quietly. Emma nodded, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Take care of yourself, Leo." He hesitated, then stepped forward, pulling her into a brief, unexpected hug. She stiffened at first, then allowed herself to relax, if only for a moment. When he pulled away, his eyes searched hers one last time before he finally stepped out the door. The sound of it closing behind him echoed in the empty house, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts. She sank onto the couch, staring at the space where he'd been just moments before. The days that followed were agonizing. Emma threw herself into work, desperate to distract herself, but her mind kept drifting back to Leo. His touch, his voice, the way he'd looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. She knew she'd made the right decision, but the ache in her chest refused to subside. At night, she found herself replaying their kiss in her mind, torn between regret and longing. It wasn't until the weekend came that she allowed herself to truly confront her feelings. Sitting alone in the living room, the memories came flooding back with a force that left her breathless. She realized that what she felt for Leo wasn't something she could ignore or bury. But it was also something she couldn't act on, not without risking everything she'd worked so hard to build. A week later, Emma found herself scrolling through her phone, her finger hovering over Leo's contact. She wanted to reach out to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Before she could overthink it, her phone buzzed with a message. Her heart leapt when she saw his name. "Leo, I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted to check in." No pressure to respond. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her emotions warring within her. She typed and deleted several responses before settling on one. "Emma, I'm okay. Hope you are too. Thank you for understanding." His reply came quickly, almost as if he'd been waiting. "Leo, always. Take care of yourself, Emma." She stared at the screen for a long time after that, the conversation leaving her with a bittersweet sense of closure. The house felt quieter than ever, but for the first time, Emma didn't mind. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't keep running from her feelings. As she sat by the window, watching the rain fall, she allowed herself to hope, not for a resolution, but for the strength to navigate the complicated path she found herself on. Some stories didn't have neat endings. Some were meant to linger, unresolved, like a melody that never quite finished. And for now that was enough.